All right, apologies for that, everyone. A little bit of a nightmare. All right, I'll go ahead and kick us off. Thank all of you for joining today, the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we are heading into the 23rd series out of the Aion and the discussion around Deleuze's conception of time, which is not simple, we'll go ahead and say. As always, please, if you want to follow us, jump on Twitter, DNGQC. If you like what we're doing, want to support us, it's DGQC on Patreon. Any major announcements or stuff before we kick it into full gear? Outside of the fact that we have our Divagations conference that we're trying to put together, please head to the Divagations section on our Discord or hit us on Twitter. We have a bunch of info there and sign-up sheets. Any help would be much appreciated. Anything besides that?
Join us this Saturday as we resume our Deleuze reading group with our introduction to the Zhuangzi, which is one of the foundational texts of Taoism, written sometime during the Warring States period. We're going to be beginning Saturday night at whatever time we usually meet. Let me check the calendar real quick.
Is it 6 or 7 p.m.? I want to say it's
7 p.m. Pacific time.
Anything else before I dive in?
Yeah, the Bergson group is still discussing the Deleuze's essay on Bergson's conception of difference. Thursdays, 10 a.m. PST as always. It's the fourth week. Our recordings are available in the Bergson channel, as is a PDF and all other infos you will need. See you Thursday.
Yeah, and on Friday we will continue our reading of the first draft of The Ages of the World by Schelling on the Continental Philosophy server from 9 to 11 a.m. PDT. So after a longer hiatus, we will start reading along the first book of this text, or better to say, of this fragment that was never published, and we will dive into Section E, the horror of divine solipsism. So yeah, if you want to attend, just join us on the Continental Philosophy server. We are still at the very beginning of this text, so don't feel ashamed to join us, and just read beforehand the 10 pages, I guess. And yeah, let's have some fun there.
Nice and easy. And as always, our anti-Oedipus reading is every Tuesday, noon PST. So, the 23rd series of Aion opens up. Finally, we are going to be discussing the very confusing notion of Deleuze's conception of time. At this point, we've talked so much and used the terms Aion and Chronos so very, very much that it's about time we actually broke them down. And I think a good way to start this actually may be just simply talking through and reading the first bits of sentence actually from this. So if you'll indulge. From the start, we have seen how two readings of time, time as Chronos and time as Aion, were opposed. One, in accordance with Chronos, only the present exists in time. Past, present, and future are not three dimensions of time. Only the present fills time, whereas past and future are two dimensions relative to the present in time. In other words, whatever is future or past in relation to a certain present, a certain extension or duration, belongs to a more vast present, which has a greater extension or duration. This is going to get fun, as you can probably tell. The thing we open with here is just simply talking through how we oppose Chronos and Aion. Aion, as it's been described many times up to this point, is that of the line forward and back from the present, from Chronos, the infinitely divisible amount of time in the future or past, versus Chronos, which is the time around us, the present that is infinitely measured, but ultimately subdivided. Gets confusing. These things layer over each other. Does anyone want to jump in and start with this first paragraph and sort of talk through the present that God experiences, which is chronos?
Yeah, I think he's talking about the, let's call it the exterior relationship between chronos in terms of the past, present, future. So he says past, present, future, not three dimensions of time, and only the present fills time. And whereas past and future are two dimensions relative to the present in time. So in chronos, it's the past, it's the present, which is time. It counts as time in a sense, and whereas the future and past are dimensions of the present. So it says the past and future are two dimensions relative to the present in time. So he says, in other words, whatever is future or past in relation to a certain present belongs to a more vast present. So this idea of there's this notion of a more vast present, which this kind of greater present, I should say, which is in relation to chronos, and the kind of relation of the future and the past, which, as you said, Brooks, we will see later have this relationship to Aion. Are in terms of chronos, that they're just dimensions of time, they're dimensions of the present, I should say. So we understand the future from the present as we understand the past from the present in the sense of chronos.
Yeah, it's a really tough thing to sort of wrap your head around fully. I just linked a PDF that's a fantastic breakdown of Aion and Chronos, Deleuze, and the Stoic conception of time. The line I like that kind of gets to this is the past and future of the present day, which is yesterday and tomorrow, are merely parts of the larger present that is the present week. Thus, there exists a series of presents of differing extensions, enveloping one another, all ultimately enveloped by this cosmic present, this chronos, this, as I think the literal words Deleuze uses here is the one God experiences, with God as the extreme circle or the external envelope. Inspired by the Stoics, Boethius said that the divine present complicates or comprehends the future or the past. It's a comprehension rather than an actual experience. Well, the present is essentially the place we start from.
Hello.
I think
Yeah.
there's this reference to God. I think we have this notion of the cosmos. We have this kind of notion within the Stoic thought. We have this notion of the kind of the guiding intelligence, and I suspect this kind of reference to God is this idea of the guide, the thing that kind of guides the guiding thought, which is experienced as present.
So would it be correct to understand the chronos as being identified with the actualities of our experience as identities, and in terms of common sense, good sense, and so we think of ourselves as living in this moment of let's say we say this week, this month, we're living in this year, and so we think of ourselves as spread out, from the past to the future, but in terms of a present experience of actuality.
Yeah, I think in this section he's talking more generally about the relation between chronos and its relationship to the future and to past. And he says at the end of the paragraph, he says chronos is an encasement, a coiling up of relative presence. So this notion of relative presence, which is the relationship between future and the past to the present, I would say. But there is a greater presence, which I think is where God comes in which encases everything. So he says chronos is an encasement. It's a coiling up of relative presence with God as the extreme circle, the external envelope. So we have in chronos this notion of circularity, So the extreme circle, which will be developed further in the next section.
Right, the circularity in terms of time, right? Time is a kind of circularity of clock time. Of course, we have digital time that seems to but we're used to this cycles of time of days, uh, into nights and nights into days, and so the kind of repetition is kind of circular. But yeah, the encasement of also the concept of God as if that was it's always that concept brings us to the experience of what is present.
Yeah, I think the essential idea is that in Chronos, so it's experienced as the present within which the past and the future are dimensions of the present, and there are there's the notions of relative presence, which are to do with the way in which the past and future are experienced. They're relative to the present, so they're not things in themselves, they're relative to the present, but there is a larger present which encompasses them all, which is characterized as the extreme circle or external envelope. And I think this notion of the circularity is developed further in the next section.
Hmm. And it's not only a circularity, but also this mixture, as Deleuze points out, of past and future, depending almost on the perspective of a spectator, so to speak. Like there is this mixture of past, present, and future within this godly presence, like within Kronos, the god who devoured his own children, his own future, so to speak, and cut off the penis of his past to elaborate or to postulate. Yeah, that's the correct word. Himself as this omnipresent, this unity of almost a cosmos, and trying to withhold this development of his own future within his children, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, etc. Um, so in some extent, it's a mixture, but also kind of static, I would say, because everything is already laid out and mixed together within this almost unifying presence, or subsumed under it.
That would also include the circularity of language, right? And in this kind of way of thinking about oneself and one's identity as in the present, right?
I think he says in the next section, I'm not sure if it's static, because he said there is a circularity and there is a further circularity. So it's like the notion of an Aion, a circularity, that cosmos will give rise to another circularity. And he talks about it, but that's the next section we haven't come to yet. But then in terms of language, I think one of the things Deleuze says, it says, and again, looking to the future in this chapter, language is derived from Aion. He says that quite very clearly, I would say. So it doesn't really relate to Chronos in the sense that Deleuze discusses it.
Yeah, I was thinking about the one aspect of language of denotation and manifestation and signification as a kind of a circularity. But yeah, out of this, the kind of realizing the paradoxes of language, it's able to get out of that circularity. But there is a circularity in that language of representation, isn't it?
Can you say that one more time? One more time for me? Sorry.
So I was thinking of the one aspect of language that that he refers to as being circular in the three aspects of language, denotation, manifestation, and signification. That at that one level, it is circular, and that would be part of that, part of that Chronos way of looking at of your language and the use of language.
Like I said, I think in this chapter he talks about language, but in terms of Aion, and in terms of those the three relations you just mentioned in terms of denotation, manifestation, signification, but then obviously in terms of sense as well. I'm not sure if it's circular. I'm not sure about that. Should we go on to number 2?
Yeah, because I think that's actually where we get into the circular. Actually,
Yeah.
so please, Derek, go ahead.
Oh, right. No, I was just saying we should perhaps look at number 2. But so number 1, it's more generally to do the relationship. I would say it's like the external relationship between the present, the past, and the future, and relation to Chronos. But now he's talking in this next number. So that's number 1. So number 2, he talks about inside Chronos, and he talks about as he's been talking all along up to now about the notion of the corporeal and the bodily, which has this relation to Chronos. And we talked about this notion of time, of mixtures or blendings, the very process of blending, and to temper. And I think I was trying to think that temper is kind of adding something to something, I think, to make it stronger or whatever, or to change it. Or to temper or to temporize is to mix.
It is tempering steel is putting it all together, smashing it, making sure tempering steel. It's a blacksmith term, is what my brain goes to right away.
Yeah.
The very next sentence, he kind of lays it out cleanly. The present measures out the action of bodies and causes. To go back to the thing Trad was bringing up, that this is also about the bodies, the mixtures, the blendings, the process of blendings, the inside of Chronos is the sort of experiencing of that. The quote, "The future and past are rather what is left of passion in a body, but as happens, the passion of a body refers to the action of a more powerful body. This great present, the divine present, is the great mixture, the unity of corporeal causes among themselves. It measures the activity of the cosmic period in which everything is simultaneous. Zeus is also Dia, the through, or that which is mixed, the blender." This massive present, then, as it exists, is essentially the mixture of the bodies. Sort of the snapshot of it, if you want to say it in that way. That's how I read it. No?
Yeah, no, you just learn the next section. So he said the greatest present is not therefore unlimited. So it has a limit. It pertains to the present to delimit. So in the present, what's in the present is given a limit. But it then and to be the limit. Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, for me it read like this image of a circle. So there's this eternal circular nature of this time and this unifying presence of Chronos. Like the movement never stops, and by that it is infinite because it's always circling around, but it's still going through this one circle after this one principle of Chronos. So it's still under the one and only divine principle and never able to really break out of this, to change. So it's a constant and infinite movement, but never able to break out of this because it lacks a specific dimension or the contrast or the difference to this divine principle of Chronos.
We also have Qdat. I'm gonna guess I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Makes a great comment. The essential reference here is the distinction between corporeals and incorporeals. which I think is a really fair point, because that's the idea. The present is ultimately a corporeal element, chronos within it, the mixtures of bodies and causes. Those are the elements, but they're ultimately corporeal at this point. Corporeal and this, as Triad was saying, this kind of ongoing sort of setup. It's a really good way to think through it. Also, QDAC, you should be able to be unmuted if you wish to talk. You don't have to, though. I'm happy to read out what you type. All right, should we move on to the third part of Chronos then? Or do we want to discuss a little bit more in here? All right. The third element within Chronos is this idea of the perfect mixture. This one I didn't fully grasp, and I'd love someone to be able to perhaps explain it better than Deleuze does, which is not great to me here. But it's this idea of the great year, how the great year is measured. Where do we draw the measure? Do the bodies which fill it possess unity, or do their mixtures possess enough justice and perfection in order for the present to avail a principle of an immanent measure? Perhaps it does at the level of the cosmic Zeus, but is this the case for bodies at random and for each partial mixture? Is there not a fundamental disturbance of the present, that is, a ground which overthrows and subverts all measure, a becoming mad of depths which slips away from the present? Anyone want to explain that shit to me? Be great.
Yeah, I think essentially I agree that this is, to me, a very difficult section to get one's head around. But I think essentially this is where Chronos is undermined by the future and the past. So that's the thing I'd say. I mean, it's how that comes about is kind of less clear, I would say. At the beginning, he gives like a definition of Chronos. Chronos is the regulated movement of vast and profound presence. So it's regulated movement.
But inside of Chronos, but it's the next line there is, where does it draw its measure? How does it know? And so if we go back, let's just go back to series 1. How do we know Alice is getting bigger? How do we know that there's a quality to anything? Where do we draw measures from? Do the bodies within it possess enough unity that we're able to do such a thing? Or do we need more? Is what he's starting to explain here, this idea that ultimately for us to have the measure, Aeon's necessary for us to be able to add the qualitative elements to these things. That Chronos only ever expresses the literal present of itself, and this naturally sort of, because it's becoming, like the act of becoming doesn't have quality to it, it's just simply becoming. Is that the point he's trying to make here, that we can't answer because it's essentially Chronos is more or less indifferent?
Well, I think the idea is this notion of regulated movement, and he asked, do the bodies, he said, do they, but where does that measurement, the ability to measure, to order things come from? And he said, I think the question he's asking is, do the bodies themselves do they have that within themselves? He says, do their mixtures, so the bodies when they come together, possess enough justice and perfection? So in order for the present to avail a principle of an immanent measure, so it's a measure that's immanent to the body, so the body that's contained within the body, and within the bodies, I should say, that are brought together in this idea of mixture. And he says perhaps it does at the level of the cosmic Zeus, so that the kind of general, the larger whole, the great, the kind of very large present. But is this the case of bodies at random for each partial mixture? So I think there is a sense of this, the bodies be undermining this notion of Chronos.
I think what could be helpful here is there is a book by Sean Bowden, I think, called The Priority of Events, which goes into Deleuze and the Stoics quite a bit. And I think what we see here is actually Deleuze taking issue with the Stoic interpretation of Chronos, because for the Stoics, Zeus um, Zeus is the one who knows about everything that's going to happen. So everything makes sense to Zeus. So the way in which there is a huge cosmic present is that from the perspective of Zeus, everything is present because he can see everything, he understands everything, right? So this is why it says here, I think, there is this perfection, there is this unity at the level of cosmic Zeus. And the distinction Deleuze wants us to make here is that, well, okay, so what if we're not Zeus, right? None of us is God. And let's look at the smaller scale, right? So do we have, on the small scale, we can't explain on the basis of what we understand as the present. We can't explain everything that's going to happen in the future, right? If you think about a billiard ball, this a very ideal sort of physics system that we see in physics classes, if you know the speed and velocity and so on of every ball, then you know what's going to happen all the way into the future. But we don't have that for the cosmos. So I think this is what he's getting at when he says, well, okay, so in the present, our present does not include everything that goes forward into the future. We can't work out the exact future from our present. And this is why the past and the future, they come to poison the present, right? The present is no longer entirely see-through. We can't see through time anymore. And Deleuze is going to go on just after the bit you quoted. Does this uncertainty, does this mistrust, does it expand, right? So can we actually believe that there is a God, a Zeus, who is able to see everything? Or is there always going to be this undermining of understanding?
Right. So it's again, I guess, in a very abstract sense, this idea of order against chaos almost, and this mistrust against this divine and unifying or ubiquitare, if this word exists in English, order of Zeus that is just establishing itself. Because in Greek mythology, even though Zeus has a genealogy, he came from something and established his order by violence. So still there's a past and a future to it. And there is this trust maybe within the pantheon, but also some kind of mistrust. And we can see here this idea, or Deleuze asking for a ground or a confusion of the present, or maybe this getting insane. I don't know how it is expressed in the English text, but in the German translation, it is literary verrückt werden, to be moved, becoming moved, or being displaced in the sense of the depths of the presence, or yeah, becoming mad. So there is this almost n- negative or contrary force here, of something corrupting, not always this expansion of this one order that is always repeating itself and integrating each and every new event that is happening in this contingent motions of the particular. But maybe these particular notions of contingency, of randomness, can create in the whole system, if we use this perspective, a shift in the whole aspect how this system even moves and maybe develops. So it is not only integrated and brought under this logic of the Chronos or maybe the Zeus, but is able to break out of it and enable a new form of temporal movement and succession. And this is not only something you can find, for example, in authors like Bergson, in Schelling, but yeah, in Meister Eckhart, in Boehme, and yeah, the Stoics. Deleuze is referring to.
Is it possible to think of the Chronos and Aion in terms of the three syntheses that they talked about in difference in repetition?
I was hoping someone was going to ask the question and that someone else would have the answer.
Can you ask it in a slightly different way? Because I'm still having trouble. Honestly, I'm still having trouble grasping this conception of this last two paragraphs in here before we move on to Aion, where he's talking about the becoming mad of depth is then a bad chronos, or the good chronos of the living present. These conceptions I'm having a lot of trouble with.
And I can't help but link his talking about the chronos in terms of what he talked about in the difference repetition as the, the virtual, becoming actual. The actual are what I see as these corporeal bodies, that have this these concepts of, uh, God, the self, and ideas of, living in the present, right? And the future and the past is relative, but for the actualities of these corporeal bodies, so what's real is the present, and that's what he means by chronos. But it's in terms of these actual corporeal bodies, that are constantly bumping up against each other and developing these well sharing these common ideas about time and the present and past and future and concepts like God, infinity. Yeah.
I think one of the things we seem to be missing is within the chronos is this notion of depth, and which has been a kind of element that's been developed throughout logic, well, through the last few series of Logic of Sense. And I have an idea that chronos is being split between the kind of what he calls the good chronos and the bad chronos, and the bad chronos is the depth. He talks about in the next, it's a kind of becoming mad of depth, and this is an idea that's been developed previous to this series. And he then says Saturn grumbles from deep within Zeus. So Saturn, I would say, personifies the notion of the bad chronos, and Zeus is perhaps a good chronos. And so he goes on in that. This is that second paragraph of number 3. Bodies have lost their measure. So bodies at beginning have the thing that seems to have the measure that allows this regulated movement of chronos. But he says within this depth, but bodies have lost their measure, are now but simulacra. So they look like their bodies. So in the past and the future, as the leash foot take their revenge in one and the same abyss. So again, it's this depth which threatens the present and everything that exists. And I think for me, I think this notion of chronos is being undermined by this kind of splitting it in two between the kind of good and the bad kind of idea, and in which the bodies, which are the thing through which chronos engage in this regulation, this kind of measure, this idea, the process of measurement is undermined, and the bodies lose their measure, and they become, as he said, just become simulacra.
So if I can pick up,
the past and present.
Sorry, go ahead. Do you want to finish your thought?
No, you carry on. Go.
I was just going to go back to the reference to difference and repetition, where I think the closest approach to difference, the synthesis of time in difference and repetition here, is the living present. We can sort of equate the living present with chronos, right? Where the living present, it depends on, to go back a bit, the living present includes the immediate future, the retained future, and the immediate past as well. And you can expand that. So the living present, if you remember, Deleuze talks about there's a limit to how much an organism can contract within a living present. And if we think about chronos, where he talks about here, chronos is a present. It can be bigger and it can be smaller. Well, that is just the degree of contraction that an organism can have. And Zeus here is taken as the ultimate contractor. He is able to contract everything in the past and everything in the future into one living present and one chronos. So, okay, I'm going to stop there.
No, I think I mean, that helps me understand a lot of this, because it's the challenge becomes then, and I'm going to try to maybe say this in a different way. When we're talking through the good chronos or bad chronos, I suppose, I still want to get into that, but we are talking essentially about the fact that we have a present that from our position, we're able to take a look and quantify sort of the amount of time dependent on sort of a perspectivist approach. This is today, this is now, this is the minutes, it's whatever it is, but it's everything that is in that sort of as a snapshot all together. And this totalizing time that is constant and becoming, and wherever I'm at in terms of like chronos, doesn't necessarily relay with the same measurements as looking forward and past. Well, maybe I'm not understanding it as well as I thought. I thought I maybe had a decent ramble there, but no.
I think the thing about what we have to remember, that this series is called the series of the Aion. It's not the series of Chronos. So what he's doing is beginning by articulating different relationship between Chronos. Well, saying what Chronos is, but saying how Chronos is undermined. And I think it's essentially undermined by the notion, the elements that are essential to the Aion, which are the past and the future. And I think we've got to understand again, where does this fit into the system of thought that's been developed within the logic of sense? And it is to do with, as the title says, the logic of sense, how sense is expressed, and the relationship of the Aion within that kind of expression of things like the paradox and the kind of, just the notion of sense and the aleatory point and things like that. So I think what's happening here, in my reading, I think this first section is to do with Chronos and the undermining of Chronos before going into Aion, where we get the kind of the development of the notion of Aion in relation to the logic of sense.
Yeah. So is he saying?
Going back to what you.
Yeah.
Go on, you go.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So is he saying that Chronos is actual, right? It's the people who we tend to believe in the present, and that's the actual experience of how we live, how corporal bodies live. But the Aion is real, right? As well. I mean, and that's what he's talking about. And this series is about the Aion, but in contradiction to the Chronos.
I'm not sure. Well, he says at the beginning, he says there are two readings of time. So the first is Chronos, and he says in accordance with the Chronos, only the present exists in time. So that's it. So he sums up in those two sentences, that one sentence, I should say. So in accordance with Chronos, only the present exists in time, and past and the future and the past are just dimensions of that present, which might be a single present, or it might be a vast present. And it has this notion of the Chronos as being a thing that encases all this. Everything's called up within that. But he says he then analyzes it from within this kind of concept, with this relationship to the past and the future. And he says fundamentally, Chronos is overturned, and this allows him now to go into the next section, which he then. He's kind of dealt with Chronos, and he's now going to deal with Aion.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that there is a sense in Chronos, but there is a more real sense in Aion?
Well, I would say that the sense is what's developed within Aion. That's the kind of, in a sense, the essence of Aion is that the sense is developed within that idea of time that's given by
Right.
Aion,
Yeah.
I think.
So when he talks about the event and sense, he's talking about the sense of time in terms of Aion.
Yeah, I think that's the structure he's developed throughout the book so far. And yeah, that's what I would say. I mean, that's my understanding.
Right, right. Yeah.
I mean, just going on to that second paragraph in number 3, just towards the end of it, and I think this was something that relates to last week's series, which is to do with the crack.
Right.
And he has this notion of chronos has become a deep break.
Exactly.
So which I think, having been a corporeal mixture, chronos has become a deep break.
Right.
And again,
right.
this is a thing that's kind of seen at the surface.
Right, right. There's a kind of a life force in the chronos, but at the same time, it also embodies the maybe the death drive, which he mentions that just before he gets to number 1 on page 164, before he talks about Aion, that he says that Chronos wants
Well,
Chronos wants to die, but it has not already
that comes up.
way to another being of time. Yeah. So.
I mean, I think this notion of chronos, it comes across this theme of schizophrenia, of madness, the becoming mad of depth, is something that keeps reoccurring in this book. So I'm trying to remember which one it was, but when he talks about Antonin Artaud, there is that sense in which he talks about it then, that's where he introduces this idea of the depth as being this kind of area of madness. And he talks again about the kind of the movement of schizophrenia. And so I think this is what he's having to do is account for that idea, and I think this is where he does, one of the places he does it, I would say, here.
I'm probably going to just get stuck on bad Chronos forever, so I'll try not to hold back. It's trying to link back to what I do know about Stoic conceptions of time, I think is starting to become problematic for me, which is fine. Bad Chronos is going to be a problem for my brain. That's okay. But I do think it is time, to the point, it is the series of Aion, and I think most of our discussion will end up coming back. We'll probably be able to start solving some of my questions and other questions if we just do push through and we get to Aion and have a discussion of the past and future and how it is infinitely forward and back, to just read the next opening of the paragraph. In accordance with Aion, only the past and future inhere or subsist in time, instead of a present which absorbs the past and future. The future and past divide the present at every instant and subdivide it ad infinitum into past and future in both directions at once. Or rather, it is the instant, without thickness and without extension, which subdivides each present into past and future, rather than vast and thick presents which comprehend both future and past in relation to one another. Would anyone like to take a crack at this opening explanation of Aion?
Yeah, so it's worth going through this carefully. So this is in accordance with Aion. So he's using the same kind of introduction as he said in accordance with Chronos. So in accordance with Aion, only the past and future inhere or subsist in time. I think those two words are important to kind of notice. They inhere and subsist. They don't exist in time. They inhere. They have this inherence and subsistence within time. So this kind of idea of kind of lurking presence, I suppose you would call it. So instead of a present which absorbs the past and future, which is Chronos, a future and past divide the present at every instant. So it's kind of almost reversing that relationship. So the previous idea of chronos was that it was a present which absorbs the past and future, but now as the future and past divide the present at every instant. So this notion of instant, which is a kind of a term which will occur later, and subdivide ad infinitum into past and future. So the present is divided ad infinitum into past and future. And again, this is an idea that's developed throughout the book, and it's starting with Alice, who gets bigger and smaller at the same time. So it's this is where the idea was first introduced, right at the beginning of the book, in both directions at once. He said it's the instant without thickness or without extension. Therefore, it doesn't have the idea of thickness. I think is an interesting one. But the way I would most commonly think about that, it doesn't have a front and a back. It's without a front and it's without a back, and without extension. It doesn't expand, shall we say? I'm not sure. So it is the instant which, without thickness, without extension, which subdivides each present, past, future, rather than, so then he's contrasted again with chronos, rather than vast and thick. So thick, again, is something that has a front and a back, and thick presence, which comprehends both future, past, in relation to one another.
So it's, just like what he described as the virtual in difference in repetition, that it's not in terms of time that the virtue exists. It's like Aion is not a it doesn't have it doesn't even have a past and future, or right, as well as a present. There's no time. It seems to be outside of time, right? But he still calls it Aion in terms of time. But it's like he says that the past and future inheres or subsists in time. It doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, they inhere and subsist in time.
Right. So they don't really
have this.
Yeah, they don't really exist.
Well, yeah, I think it depends again. I think we need to use these terms quite exactly, but exist has a different meaning to subsist.
Exactly, right.
And then inhere.
Right.
So these are phrases he's used again.
Right.
They're not here for the first time. They've been used previously. So the things inhere and they subsist. I think he used it in terms of propositions, if I remember correctly, but I might be wrong there. But this notion of inherence and subsistence is things that have been constant throughout the book, I would say.
So to me, it means that it implies that it doesn't even. It perhaps it's outside of time. You can't even speak of it in terms of time. It's just like the way he talks about the virtual in the other book, the first book. That the virtual is.
I think they're in time, and they have an effect within. They're there within the notion of time here in terms of Aion. Their presence is important to this notion of Aion.
Right.
So they're not outside of it. They're not, or else they wouldn't be here. They inhere and subsist in time.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they're not there. They inhere and subsist. So below. So they're like almost, like I said, they're kind of lurking around. It's different. It's related. The word subsist relates to exist, but it's not as strong as idea as that, I would say.
It's like a mobile strip that that there's this in terms of you can see it in terms of the two surfaces. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's where it's without thickness, and the image he uses for that is the Mobius strip, which has no front and no back.
Okay.
You can't say this is the front of the Mobius strip and this is the back, because if you follow it along, the things will be reversed.
Is it that essentially they're simultaneous, and for playing with one, the other one is sort of sitting there also? Like there's a simultaneity to experiencing them and how they sort of create. I mean, he's going to be getting into a little bit of the organization and the differences Aion has from Chronos a lot more specific, but it feels like there's a lot of simultaneity. Lou posted a piece from Deleuze's reading of Bergson that they're doing for the Bergson group, or checking out. Duration is a coexistence of a whole other kind. It is real coexistence, simultaneity. This is why the virtual coexistence that defines duration is at the same time a real succession, whereas matter in the end presents us less with a succession than the simple material of simultaneity, real coexistence, juxtaposition. It feels like it's a play towards them being essentially on top of each other, simultaneous.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure that's true.
Well, just the lack of thickness, his comment around thickness, it feels like he's pointing to saying that there's no distance between them. Like he's trying as hard as he can to just say like that these things are very much on top of each other. No?
Yeah, he calls it the instant without thickness and without extension, which subdivides each present into past and future. So I think this is saying this is what the Aion does, in which the past and future inhere. And I think he develops this idea further.
I mean, I think this would make more sense if we think about where he is going with this. The distinction between Aion and Chronos is really the one between bodies and events, right? Whereas bodies, I posted a thing in Discord about the concept of the quasi-cause, the concept of quasi-causality. And I think that's really an important difference between bodies and events. Bodies cause things in each other, right? So whereas events can only be quasi-causal. And in the same way, you can have causes, you can have bodies causing things in Chronos, but when we talk about events and the quasi-cause, we are in the regime of Aion. And this is, I think our problem with Aion and Chronos is because it seems unmotivated. Why are we making this distinction? And the distinction between bodies and events will help us figure out, okay, so this is why we need to distinguish the time of Chronos and the time of Aion.
So the next question he asks, following that opening section you read, Brooks, he asks, what difference is there between this Aion and the becoming matter depth, which already overturn Chronos within its own domains? So again, this is clarification of the previous section we read, that number 3, and again this importance of depth, the becoming mad. Again, this notion of depth and the becoming madder depth, which already overturned Chronos within its own domain.
To me, and maybe this association is a bit too vague or out there, it reads like there is this connection, yes, at one point to language, but also to this idea of Chronos being this time form of an intensity, as something as Lou posted before of Deleuze explanation of Bergson, that real coexistence, simultaneity, time is a real succession. So we have this real succession, something incorporeal, something with its own rule, its own intensities that are interwoven with each other and creating their own duration, their own presence, and actuality in this sense. And in Aion, we don't have this. It is more abstract. It is more formal in the sense of virtuality and in the form of, as we already said, of quasi-causes that are not very much actualized and real yet. And I guess that's why we later come to this idea of this incorporeal effects that enable in their surface effects language, because it is this meta idea of an somewhat infinite structure like langage in France. This third idea, besides langue and parole, this language as an abstract system that every aspect of language is always referring to in this idea, but is not in any form differentiated or incorporated in specific forms like dialects and specific expressions of language. So it has not this form of sense yet, of some form of intensity. But Aion is this idea of a thick, opaque time that we cannot look through because it has not this inner mechanisms yet, or better, it has this just thick dichotomy between past and a future without any form of lively present that is able to temporalize and spatialize its realm, if this makes sense.
I come back to silence. Come on, people. Where did I leave
I
off?
just talked for a minute. Don't.
Where did we leave off? Or where can we head next?
I was on mute. Sorry. No, I don't know if I kind of was on mute, I just realized. But I think within this section, we have this notion of the now and the instant. So one of the things he's trying to do is develop the difference between Aion and Chronos. And he uses these two terms, the now and the instant, derived from Parmenides. And I think the instant is this idea that's relation to Aion. So it's no longer the future and past which subvert the existing present. So again, the present in terms of Chronos exists. It is the instant which perverts the pervert. The pervert is a reference to the perversion of the Stoics. Perverts the present into inhering future and past. So in a sense, I think one of the things that's being said is that the Chronos is a kind of time of now, whereas the Aion is the time of the instant. And he goes on to say, if depth evades the present, this is again, depth is to do with the Chronos. It's always to do with Chronos. if depth obeys the present, it is with all the force of a now, which opposes its panic-stricken present to the wise present of measure. So that's kind of a really interesting phrase, because this is the kind of how the chronos was overturned, because it has this notion of measurement, but it's undercut. And in a sense, he's now saying it in a different way. It's panic-stricken present to the wise present of measure. These two, this is how it's undercut in terms of the now. And if the service evades the present, it is with all the power of an instant. Which distinguishes its occurrence from any assignable present, subject to division and redivision. And he goes on, he references this notion, this kind of mythical notion, which he's touched on previously. Nothing sensitive without changing its nature. Aion no longer belongs to Zeus or Saturn. So Zeus and Saturn were the two figures of Chronos. Zeus is a figure of, I would say, is a good Chronos. Saturn is a bad Chronos that grumbles within, but to Hercules. And as we saw earlier in the book, not in this section, but earlier, Hercules personifies the notion of the thing that brings the bodies and things to the surface. So Hercules is in a sense a figure of the Stoic, actually.
Right, because inherently to Hercules is this circle, or this movement or voyage of the hero, right? So there is inherently within Hercules this idea of succession, of overcoming oneself and going through these trials to become something more than you are.
Yeah, and the figure of Hercules actually is the figure of the Stoic. So he has the cloak and he has the staff. So in Hercules' cake, it's a lion. I think it's a lion skin he wears, and he carries a club. But I think at some point, I can't remember if it's here or previously, Deleuze said that this is the figure, the mythologized figure of the Stoic. That brings things, and what does Hercules do? He brings things to the surface, and this is what the Stoic philosophy does. It brings things to the surface.
So Hercules would represent the good Chronos, on the surface, and the bad Chronos would be perhaps the death instinct, death drive.
I think Hercules is within Aion. It's not within Chronos. I think I don't know. I mean, I just speculated that perhaps the good Chronos is Zeus and the bad Chronos is Saturn, which I think is to do with Chronos, whereas Hercules is to do with the surface, and I would say it has to do with Aion. Well, in fact, it says Aion no longer belongs to Zeus or Saturn, but to Hercules.
Oh, really? What does it say?
And again, this next sentence is quite important. Whereas Chronos express the action of bodies and the creation of corporeal qualities. So that notion of we talked about previously, for example, being dead is a corporeal quality. Aion is the locus of incorporeal events and of attributes which are distinct from qualities. And again, in that one sentence, you get a really amazing expression of what this section is about, I would say.
Well, to go back, the idea of good or bad Chronos, because I am going to be stuck on this. Let me try to say another way, maybe how I'm understanding it now. So we have Saturn and Zeus. Let's talk about those things as kind of good or bad mixtures within it. Saturn is, as he was talking in previous series about those who dove into or lived within the depths, or being inside of that space with only those elements. This becoming mad is what he's discussing. Whereas with Aion plays the role of Hercules, as he described before. Hercules fought in the depths, but pushed towards the surface and sort of slayed the demon, slayed the monsters of the depths. Essentially, was his task. Aion enables that same thing. We could be spending our time in this measureless, fucked up place within the bodies, these depths that subvert all measures of the present, this becoming mad, the schizo, as in previous parts he's described, versus Aion, which allows us to sort of be at the surface, slay those elements, and not have that becoming man sort of push into the whole universe. Or am I way off still?
I just think, well, he says, I think he just says it quite clearly. Aion is a locus of incorporeal events and of attributes which are distinct from qualities, whereas Chronos express the action of bodies and the creation of corporeal qualities. So this, again, is what he's doing in this section. He's looking at what is the difference between Chronos and Aion. So Chronos express the action of bodies, and it's kind of over, just going back to your kind of notion, your kind of difficulty with good and bad Chronos. I think it's in a sense overturned by itself. It's in this kind of subversion. The word is subversion when I think about it, that Deleuze uses. It's subverted by this pre-Socratic dive into the depth. And so you have this notion of the measure and the unmeasured, the unmeasurable, which is the bad Chronos. Whereas, so that, in a sense, that's the problem with Chronos. So Chronos express the action of bodies and the creation of corporeal qualities. Again, this is something, the notion, for example, death is a corporeal quality. So dead, that something is dead is a corporeal quality. So Aion is the locus of incorporeal events. So events so I think the main example of an incorporeal event is sense. That is an incorporeal event, and of attributes which are distinct from qualities. And again, that's something he talks about. For example, a tree to green, the becoming, the notion of green, the tree is to green. There are things like that he's talked about previously.
Right. As he later writes, Aion is this eternal truth of time, this pure, empty form of time, because Aion is able to open up this bodily circle of Chronos, like this autopoietic system of Chronos, where every event gets integrated. Yet Chronos is something eternal in a sense, because this circular motion is going on and on. It is still something very restricted. And in contrast to that, Aion is constantly moving in these two directions of past and future. It's spanning up this plane of time that is just infinitely flat and able to create this infinitesimal splits or forms of present of events that are constantly emerging, but not integrated into a already existing form of time with their place in it, but they are constantly emergent events that are then creating new and enriched forms and paths into the infinite past and the infinite future. So it is more like this very flat and topological plane in contrast to this eternal form of a geometric circle that is constantly recreating itself within Chronos.
Yeah, and I think that's important, because I think he says that, and again, this is really important for this notion of Aion. He said it's unwound its own circle, stretching itself out in a straight line. So this notion of Aion being a straight line is very important for this whole, to understand it. And he goes on to say it's all the more dangerous, more labyrinthine, and more tortuous for this reason. So this is kind of slightly paradoxical. It has a straight line, but it's more labyrinthine because of it. It is a straight line and more, and therefore more tortuous. I think that's a paradoxical idea, but it's not just that idea is not restricted to the logic of sense. It's also present in other things that Deleuze writes. But
Hmm.
anyway, and then he quotes from Marcus Aurelius. And this other movement. So this, I would say, this movement of the straight line, the straight line of Aion. So which occurs neither up above or down below, nor in a circular fashion, but only at the surface. The movement of virtue.
Mhm.
Right, and I guess it's something that is concerning or maybe dangerous and risky in this labyrinthic motion, because it is getting more dark and uncertain what happens in the future and what lies within the past, because everything stretches out indefinitely, not like in the circular motion where everything returns maybe in other forms, but everything gets integrated in this logic, in this logos of the chronos, and everything by that becomes somewhat predictable. But when you stand at any of this infinite in any of this infinite perspectives of presence in the time form of Aion, everything around you becomes, when you look to the horizon uh, uh, or when you look far away, your vision becomes more and more blurry, and everything becomes uncertain. You don't know when exactly time starts or when it ends, because it is stretching out and developing indefinitely, and not doing over and over the same notion and subordinating to this one divine principle.
Yeah, so it's a infinite duration and unpredictable.
And now this now brings us on to this idea of language, which we discussed previously. And he says it is this new world of incorporeal effects or surface effects which makes language possible. So in this section, again, it's an important discussion of how language is made possible by the Aion.
Well, and this goes back to the early parts where the scalpel, a body, becomes the cause to the flesh, a body, of the incorporeal predicate being cut. Fire, a body, becomes a cause to wood, a body, of the incorporeal predicate being burnt. Language developing out of these elements.
I think what we need to understand from this. So just go. So the second sentence. As we shall see, it is this world which draws the sounds from their simple state of corporeal actions and passions. So when we speak, the language has the what shall I say? The condition of being a body. It is a body, and so it's only through the Aion that it becomes language. So he says it is this new world, which I would say the world of the Aion, which distinguishes language, prevents it from being confused with the sound effects of bodies, and abstracts it from their oral anal determinations. So pure events ground language. So pure events, which is what's given off by the Aion, grounds language, makes language possible. And because they wait for it as much as they wait for us and have a pure, singular, impersonal and pre-individual existence only inside the language that expresses them. So this is the language, the expression of language is within the language, and this notion of impersonal and pre-individual, which is again an idea we've come across previously to do with the transcendental, I would say.
Well, this feels like it's pointing at these instants being those elements to go. We were having the discussion earlier about the three sort of elements of the proposition, but this is more like the the singular objects, the paradoxical entities, the aleatory points. All of these different things are these instants that seems to be this thing he's talking about.
Yeah, I think what he's doing here that's kind of different is he's making clear how the Aion enables language, enables this structure to actually function.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
like
it
that
is,
a lot.
just
Okay.
carrying on. Yeah, it is what it expresses in its independence that grounds language and expression. So again, this notion of expression is something that is separate, something that's expressed, that's given off. That is the metaphysical property that sound acquires. And the word metaphysical is I would say, is said, written almost literally. So it's beyond the physical property that sound. So sounds have a physicality, but with the Aion, it's beyond the physical. So it's it's a property they acquire beyond the physical in order to have a sense. So the sense is what language expresses. It's the expression of language. And then secondarily, so we come to this notion, and then to signify, manifest and denote. So he's given this structure in that primarily what language does through the Aion is that it enables it to to express something, to have sense beyond it's not just a physical thing. It allows it to go beyond its physicality as a sound. It's able to have an expression, and then secondarily, it enables it then to signify, manifest, and denote. Then, rather than to belong to bodies as physical qualities.
And that's the next sentence. I think pieces are starting to fall for me. The next sentence, the most general operation of sense is this. It brings that which expresses it into existence. And from that point on, as pure inherence, it brings itself to exist within that which expresses it. It rests, therefore, with the Aion as the milieu of surface effects or events, to trace a frontier between things and propositions, and the Aion traces it with its entire straight line. Without it, sounds would fall back on bodies, and propositions themselves would not be possible. Language is rendered possible by the frontier which separates it from things and from bodies, including those which speak. We can thus take up again the account of the surface organization as is determined by the Aion. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. I'm going to take a second. Jesus Christ. This one has really hurt my brain today.
So, and then the next set, he's now going to again look at what he calls the surface organization through the kind of idea of Aion. And he said the entire line of the Aion is run through by the instant, which is endlessly displaced in this line. So again, we have this notion of the Aion as being a line. It's uncurled, it's unraveled as a line. And the instant is endlessly displaced. And again, this is the thing we've had with Alice in Wonderland, a thing missing from its place. And Deleuze goes on to talk to quote from Plato, says the instant is atopon, which means without place. And again, it's the paradoxical instance or aleatory point, the nonsense of the surface and the quasi-cause. So it's a pure moment of abstraction. So this is, he talked about the structure of the surface organization determined by the Aion, and this is the first thing. He says first is this. The pure moment of abstraction's role is primarily to divide and subdivide every present in both directions, in both at once into past, future upon the line of the Aion. So that its first thing is to divide it according to this eon, to the instant, which is mobile, which is never at the place where it should be. It's without a place. And then he says second is the role of the instant is to extract singularities from the present. And singularities, again, if we remember back, is these moments of change where something happens. So the instant extracts singularities from the present, from individual persons which occupy this present. It extracts singular points twice projected, once into the future and once into the past, forming by this double equation the constitutive elements of the pure event in the manner of a pod which releases its spores. And I thought this was really interesting. I don't know if this is the first time uses this image of a pod, a seed pod releasing its spores, but I don't know if it's the first use is made in Deleuze's writing. That's obviously something that which will be repeated in later writing. So the notion of the instant, what it does, it extracts this mobile aleatory point which is never still along the line of the eon, extracts singularities from the present, from individual persons which occupy the present, and then projects them into the past and into the future, and forming by this the pure event. And then third, the straight line which extends simultaneously. So the straight line goes to the past and it goes into the future. Traces the frontier between bodies and language. So again, it's not a frontier. Again, it's coming up. It's a frontier between bodies and language. The bodies are the states of affairs, and language is the propositions through which the states of affairs are kind of spoken about. And he says language, and he comes back to again this notion of language or system of propositions would not exist without this frontier which renders it possible. So our ability to speak, to say something about things using propositions is only possible, he says, because of this frontier that's given by this line of the eon.
The separation between bodies and events. Oh, Christ.
Well, I think it's between bodies and propositions, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I also get some.
Maybe. Yeah.
I also get some Derrida vibes here, like this, when he goes on with this idea of the moment of the atopon, the atopic thing, this paradoxical instance, this point of randomness, surface unsense, quasi-cause and real abstraction moment. Sorry, I'm just translating on the fly here. It reminds me of Derrida's difference that is also necessary as this very paradoxical moment at the beginning of the production, even of sense and of meaning, before we can even think of categories like sense, meaning, etc. There are these constant breaks and these traces that split up or appear as these virtual points that then split up space and time almost when we look at them and create something like a past and the future and a here and there, for example. So the difference maybe, or here the event and these paradoxical moments, these atopic moments on the line of eon are these moments that constantly create these bifurcations that we need to even create something like differences and identities at the same time. So it is the constitutive moment, or this constitutive noise underlying everything, like this abyss that is constantly emerging forms of sense of, or later then of meaning, and our understanding of identity, and how we create these constant dichotomies, bifurcations, so we can create helpful cognitive differences.
Yeah, and he develops that idea when he says further, and he says language is endlessly born. So again, it's this notion of endlessness, and it's in both directions of the eon. So he says in the future direction of the eon, where it's established and somehow anticipated. And although it must also say the past, it says it as the past of states of affairs which go and appearing and disappearing in the other direction. So it has this constant relationship in language between the future and the past.
I just wanted to also reiterate, you're right, Derek, it's the frontier between language and bodies, not bodies and events. I did misspeak, you're right.
Yeah.
I'm a couple steps behind all y'all, so I'm happy to be slowly catching up and slowly getting there. This one is I'm not sure why it's just not clicking with me. I'm just having a lot of trouble with it. This part is making more sense though, because we're talking again about this idea of the points coming together, making the lines with the aleatory effect, with the surface coming following that, and it unfolds kind of on both sides of the thing. The setup and the creation of this of language within that, which this is kind of bringing together a lot of the stuff that he'd been building up to this point. It's just there's a few bits of words I think I'm getting my brain hung up on that I'm having trouble parsing or bringing in. So I'll avoid doing that.
Yeah.
So those paradoxes that he talked about in series 5, I think, really apply here, right? In terms of how language tries to denote the object in the present, but it's every time you do that, it's the moment is subdivided infinitely, so you cannot really denote anything without denoting what you've used to denote.
And do we want to move to the last bit here?
Yeah, and then
go for it, Derek.
Yeah, I was just going to try and perhaps finish off. I don't know where we are. Just perhaps finish off this section, then just go through that quickly. And then, so he says language is endlessly born in the future direction of the eon, where it's... Oh, we've done that already. Sorry, in short, the straight line is now related to its two environs, and while it separates them, it also articulates the one and the other as two series that are capable of being developed. So this, again, it's this notion of series is being brought in again, which you haven't heard about for a bit here. It brings to them both the instantaneous. So we have two series. One, I would suspect one is of the future, one is of the past. So it brings to them the instantaneous aleatory point, which traverses it, and the singular points are distributed in it. So I think this is given a structure. So it's given the structure of the way in which the instantaneous point is the thing that traverses between the past and present. It's what's in a sense what's connected to them. And he said there are two faces, therefore, which are always unequal and in disequilibrium. One turned towards states of affairs and the other towards propositions. But they're not allowed to be reduced to states of affairs or proposition. So the event is brought to bear upon states of affairs, but under the logical attribute of these states. So the state of affairs are kind of bodies, but what's the logical attribute of these states? So the logical implies what's spoken about them, what is said about them, and it's an attribute. It's not a property, say. It's something attributable to them. Yeah, so it's entirely so again, it's this notion of what's been said through the eon. In this notion of in language is completely it's entirely different from their physical properties, from their physical qualities, despite the fact it may happen to them, be embodied or actualized in them. So he says sense and event are the same thing, which is a kind of repetition. So sense and event are the same thing, except that now sense is related to propositions.
Which part are you on now? Which part are you on now? Are you on the final paragraph?
Still on the same. No, still on number 2.
Okay.
The final paragraph of number 2. Sorry, not on number 3 yet.
Okay.
Just going towards the end, trying to just get to the end of that. I think it's perhaps quite important just to kind of get through this as it is. So he says sense and event are the same thing, except the sense is related to propositions. Again, this is the kind of idea he's developed previously. It relates to propositions and what is expressible or expressed by them, which is entirely different from what they signify, manifest, or denote. So again, he's previously in this section, he said that we first have sense and then we have these other ideas of denotation, manifestation, etc., etc. But now he's saying that it's entirely different. So sense is entirely different from what they signify, manifest, or denote. And again, it's entirely different from sonorous qualities. So it's entirely different from the physical qualities of language.
Can you tie that in with those paradoxes that we talked about before to this idea you're just going over between language and
I think it's given I think it's given the structure, and I think from that, I would say that this is what makes a paradox possible. I would say,
right, because there's kind of a contradiction between the language and the state of affairs, right?
Yeah. And though it goes on to give the entire, so again, he's looking at the organization, what he calls the surface organization of the Aion, and he ends up by saying what that is: the point which traces the line which forms the frontier, and the surface which is developed and unfolded from both sides. So that, again, it's in a very succinct way, it encapsulates the surface organization of language, I would say, through the Aion, through this notion of Aion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's dealing
what
here
I'm
with this.
So
sorry, please go on, Ollie.
what I'm thinking, which is interesting, is like page 165. I'm not sure what version are you looking at, but that's the kind of like the last part of the the series. So there is like a comparison between Aion and then Aion and then Kronos. So I think this part, like Aion no longer belongs to Zeus and Saturn, but to Hercules, whereas Kronos expresses the action of bodies and creation of corporeal qualities. Aion is the locus of incorporeal events, and so on and so on. As such, like comparisons are going on. The point here is that I just focus on why Deleuze uses the word Zeus and Saturn and Hercules. So, based on like your discussion so far, I wanted to simplify the idea. Like I can't, and maybe we can't do that. It's kind of hard to like simplify Deleuzean idea. But if I try, if you let me try, if I can try, we can think about our history, like a human history. So, for example, for now, here and now, we are really talking really, like seriously and hard. It is a death, and it has its own kind of a space as a chronos. But thinking about like the line of the like flow of like a time, that's almost like Aion. It's like composed of the past and then like yet to come future, something like that. So point here is that Chronos is like a like the corporeal present, like a which is like some kind of death and the surface at the same time. On the other hand, like Aion is like some kind of like the entire flow of time, like a. So that's why like it's incorporeal. It can be like expressed through the language and so on. Here, Hercules, I think that's kind of a symbol of creativity. Zeus, like as a symbol of like the very dramatic like emotions and something like that. It can like of course, like Zeus is the son of Kronos, but at the end of the day, like I'm just focusing on the characteristic of Zeus or Saturn. I'm not sure about the Saturn, but it just like symbolizes characteristic of Kronos, which he has like a death. Actually, like a I was also confused with the idea of a bad Kronos as uh Bruce said, like a why bad Kronos and then good Kronos, something like that. Of course, if we connect it to the previous series, definitely like our presence is composed of a lot of I mean, complex things like the cracks and then like things and like it can be expressed as like something good and something bad and so on. So at the end of the day, the point here is that Kronos like the complexity of the present, whereas like the Aion is like the whole entire flow of time, something like that, and then I'd like to like how you think like connect in relation to the expression of Hercules and Zeus and then things like that. That's it.
I would actually really like you to expand on that, Ollie. That's fantastic. Yeah, I think not right now, obviously, but I really did like that because I think it's important we try to find ways to simplify some of these concepts because there's just a great deal being said here that's incredibly important, and it's not the kind of thing that's worth glossing over or not diving into because so many of the previous series are wholly dependent upon understanding and having a grasp of Aion and Kronos at a basic level, but being able to dive deeper in it and understanding the formation of sense, how these things play in and how these things work within each other. And then ultimately, as he goes on to talk about in the third point, the way that these ideal surfaces that ultimately come to be, because that section ends with the line I think I referenced perhaps a bit too early, which is that the entire organization in its three abstract moments runs from the point to the straight line, from the straight line to the surface. The point which traces the line which forms a frontier, and the surface which is developed and unfolded from both sides. From there, the conversation is, how do these ideal surfaces come to be? And the answer is, well, actually, they're many movements with a fragile and delicate mechanism intersect, that by means of which bodies, states of affairs, mixtures, considered in their depth, succeed or fail to produce this ideal surface. And conversely, that by means of which the events of the surface are actualized in the presence of bodies, by imprisoning first the singularities within the limits of worlds, individuals, and persons. This nature of how these idealized surfaces come to be is kind of this next bit. This does feel a bit Derridian, for sure, triad, at least to me. I'll let someone else continue, please.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's kind of a point. Like, I mean, through reading this logical sense, like we should find what points Deleuze wanted to like present to us. So I always think that like Deleuze was interested in like creativity of time, spatial temporality of human beings, and then like how like we can explicate like that kind of thing. I think in that sense, like a stoicism, like stoic idea of the temporality, like bringing like Aion and then Kronos is quite creative. I mean, quite genius. Cause like I think some papers, I mean, as I did before, still like somebody is confused with the idea of a Kronos and Aion, because I thought Aion was some kind of a circularity, I thought that's kind of like even spirality, like it has to do with like some kind of creativity. But at the end of the year, I found like Chronos is like in a way, I mean, together, like bringing, combining the idea of Aion like, as a something kind of big picture, and then Chronos like focusing on the microscopic point of the presence. We can complete the whole idea of the creativity or multiplicity, singularity, whole thing.
I love that. Would anyone like to take on the rest of this final paragraph so we can actually close it out before we hit our time? But I would, but I genuinely worry that I would say something wrong at this point because I'm gonna have to spend some time rereading and reading some more. I've linked in the text in the chat priority of events as well as Aion and Chronos, Deleuze and the Stoic time. Both are secondary sources I've been going through, and it's mostly, as they say, kicking up dust, so I can complain I can't see, but eventually I hope something will clear up. But I figure I'd let someone else take this final paragraph if you want to, because here we start talking about this quasi-cause and identifying with it and the role that a sage can play in getting back to the ethics of the Stoics, and I think it's a drive towards that. At least that's how it reads to me.
Yeah, this last part is where I find, as I said before, it connects with, difference in repetition of the idea of the actualization, right, of persons and, bodies and, individuals, in the present. And yeah, before going into this next, part you just mentioned. Yeah.
I think in this section, I think he develops the idea of the present. I found this one most obscure, but just to start about a third of the way down, he says the notion of the present has therefore several meanings. The measureless or dislocated present as a time of depth and subversion. So this is a presence of the pre-Socratics. The variable and measured present as the time of actualization. So the present of the now, I would say. So we have these two ideas of present, but so there is perhaps yet another present. So how could there be a measurable actualization? Let me just see that again.
Right.
Yeah, how could there be a measurable actualization unless a third present prevented it constantly from falling into subversion and being confused with it? So then he goes on to say that it would seem from what was been said previously, which is the idea that the present is constantly divided into past and future. It would seem that the Aion cannot have any present at all, since in it the instant is always dividing into future and past. But he said this is only an appearance. He says what is excessive in the event must be accomplished, even though it may not be realized or actualized. So it must be accomplished, but not, even though it may not be realized, i.e. made real or made actual without ruin. So between the two presents of chronos, that of subversion and that of actualization. So he's going back to this notion of the presence of chronos, that of this subversion due to the bottom, like is subversion refers to the pre-Socratics, the thing that will always go to the underground, the base, the cave, and that of the actualization in forms. So the actualization in bodies, I would say, there's a third. There must be a third pertaining to the Aion. So there must be a third, there must be a present, even though it seems from what's been said earlier, there was no present, because the present is constantly being distributed between the future and the past. And then he goes on to say, in fact, the instant as the paradoxical element or the quasi-cause which runs through the entire straight line must itself be represented. So there's this notion of the representation. And it is even in this sense, the representation can envelop an expression on its edges, although expression itself may be of another nature. And that's how you can identify the quasi-cause. So I'm not making much sense, I'm just reading this out. So he says this present of the Aion, he kind of goes on, he says the present of the Aion representing the instant. So this is where, so he said there must be a present of the Aion, even though it seems there can't be. He said this present of the Aion representing the instant. This is where it is, this is how it occurs in this notion of representation, in which if we think back to the actor who's acting out a character, the actor himself is in the present, whereas the character is kind of being in that kind of traverse, that kind of in the other world. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think the right word. Anyway, so the one's in the present and the other's not. I can't think of the right word now. So the present of the Aion represent the instant. So he's saying here, so the present of, he said there must be a third present, and so the present is in if representing the Aion instant.
Well, this is the counter-actual. It's the counter-actualization. Like this part, this is going back to that. It's the moment of the counter-actualization where the sage or the actor or the mime has turned it directly back at it, and that's kind of, it's almost this movement in, as you say, like within the present we have this measureless present of depth and subversion, and that yields a sort of variable measured presence of actualization. There's like that next level, and then ultimately we have the present of the instant, which I misused instant earlier and I was corrected very nicely, but this is the counter actualization, the present of the Aion, which ultimately conversely sort of flows the other way. It prevents the actualization from being subverted by this measureless present of depth and subversion. And these things have to sort of be all around as part of each other in order for the present to essentially be something we can even experience or know. But this perverse moment, this moment, this instant, it has no thickness. The phrase he uses I like, which is, it is the pure operation, which is a really interesting thing. It's not of the incorporation. This isn't becoming. It is the present of the pure operation, not the present of subversion or actualization, but the counter-actualization, which keeps the former from overturning the latter and the latter from being confused with the former. These elements, this counter-actualization, it's why he talks about the sage, and it in the previous, the ethics of Stoicism, and pushing us towards this sort of ethical call towards the counter-actualization. It's a big play for him, but this is why. This is how it functions and plays the other direction within the present. It allows us to undo these other things rather than sort of get stuck in them, which will ultimately undo ourselves, I suppose, or undo each other.
I'm not. I wouldn't say we undo it by this, right? Because of this counter-actualization.
We prevent the undoing is probably a better way to phrase it.
Oh, okay. Because right at the end, when he's mentioning this counter-actualization, there's the mentioning of this doubling of this double moment of the incorporation and of the subversion, I would say, if this is referring to, he's mentioned further. So again, with this perverted moment, with this counter-actualization, we have then a foil for these, the possibility of being other, the outside of us, the noise in the background that creates this information of it, the nonsense that is enabling the sense of subversion, the non-subversion that is enabling subversion, and the non-actualization, the counter-actualization that is needed for our understanding of actualization, and that cannot be reduced to it.
Oh, the counter-actualization is a way of falling into the time of chronos, right? And is that equivalent to the paradoxical element and the quasi-cause? Or are they similar in terms of, yeah, counter-actualization is a kind of, it's an operation, a pure operation. That is, it mentions the instant as the paradoxical element, quasi-cause.
Yeah, it is not yet part of this unified presence of Kronos, or maybe it is retroactively we see it as not created by it, but a moment that is withstanding this subversion and this actualization within the body of Kronos.
Right.
Something that is always not very graspable, that has not only this identity within this process of Kronos, within this cyclicity, but it has this resistance to it that cannot be subsumed under any form of representation or identification, because it has not yet these specific boundaries within this circle of Kronos, but it is not something actualized. It is this almost like a constant flux that has some sort of shape to it, but a shape that is constantly moving forward in its operation and creating maybe new forms of how it can be differentiated or identified, but never be subsumed under just one representation.
Yeah, I think it has a dual nature. It's present because it's in the present. It's the instant, but then it then has this. So just going back to when he talks about counter-actualization, it says the actor occupies the instant. So in terms of being an actor, so what he's asking is, where is the present in the Aion? Where does it exist? And he gives the character of the figure of the actor as someone who occupies the present. And he says the actor occupies the instant, while the character portrays. So the actor is himself. He is actual as the actor in his body.
Right.
But the character he's portraying portrays hopes and fears in the future and remembers or repents in the past. And it is in this sense that the actor represents. So I would say that, yeah, that's how I would understand this, in that the actor contains both. With the actor as a kind of figure of the present can contain both the present, but also the future. With future, past, and future without confusing them.
Right. In another context, he also refers to that operation as a doubling, right? Because he's doing the actor is doing, performing a doubling operation.
Yeah, because he talks about the hem, which is another thing which I can't find at the moment, but the kind of hem, the lining, which he talks about.
Right.
So it's kind of at the edge. I think he says it's at the edge, and it's the lining he references in the previous, but I can't find that at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So he says so what he's looking for is the present of the Aion. He says there are two presents of the subversion of the pre-Socratic, so the presence of the let's call it the Platonic of the bodies, but the present. So he said that this present of the Aion. He said it's not like the vast and present and deep present of Kronos. It is the present without thickness, present of the actor, dancer of mind, the pure perverse moment, present of the pure operation. So this is this notion of operation again, which he uses in the previous, I think it's in number 20, the series 20, I think, when he brings out this notion of the operator. And it says not of incorporation. In other words, it doesn't bring it into the body. It operates outwards, whereas it bring it into the body. Not the present of subversion, i.e. the pre-Socratic or actualization, i.e. let's say it's the Platonic, but I'm not sure if that's correct, but that of the counter-actualization, which holds the two together but stops one from overturning the other. So the both are present in the one.
Right, because he's dancing always already on this line, on this border, because the artist or the dancer is trying to incorporate or represent or maybe express this idea, this concept of a figure, for example. It's logic, but never gets to become the full thing, so to speak, gets totally subsumed under it or overtaken by it. And that's why an artist always still is its own thing. It's almost like this hybrid of another principle that is incorporated by a different one. So it is constantly dancing on this line between the subversion and the actualization or the becoming of the figure.
Actually, next time I would like to ask you like to talk about like doubling more like maybe like it would definitely like related to the next topic of the next series because I wish to ask like a doubling what you means is a coexistence of all possibilities. So even though like Deleuze uses like a actualization counter actualization, it's like a binary, but actually I think um what Deleuze focused on is like a multiplicity, multiple, like a multiverse, not the universe, like a lot of possibility altogether coexist, and then some points like decided, determined by language of Aion, something like that, and then we can just see through that language the present, but actually not. Like a lot of possible multiplicity, like a lot of becoming a coexist in the world, like in history, like a spatial temporal like idea. So maybe like next time we can go further, like with that kind of ideas.
Sure, I can. I guess we can do some kind of recap, or maybe the next paradox is neatly connecting to this, and expanding on this. So could be great to look back to it, as we do constantly with other with respect to other of the paradoxes.
Yeah, I think we're going to end up having to come back, and I'm going to need time to come back with a few people and have you explain a few things, or at least talk through it, because we're starting to reach, I mean, we don't have terribly longer in the book, but definitely this was a lot. This was a lot. I'll probably annoy you, Ollie, or everyone. I'll probably put a ping out sometime this week. We should do like a recap and rediscussion over a couple of these things, the doubling up, the nature of what they're talking about through a few things, and kind of just do a general question and discussion thing. I think it'd be worthwhile.
Yeah, thank you so much for your like a rich the discussion. I was able to understand the latter part. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, and I think I will close out there because, and thank all of you for joining and helping explain stuff, because as I said a few times, this was a tough one. Last night fried me, and today it's starting to get difficult. So thanks, Derek. Thank everyone for joining up. Please,
thanks everyone.
Please pay attention. We'll be pinging out. We'll be doing a random discussion chat, probably think through Thursday-ish morning, maybe Friday. But I'll put a ping out. We'll get something going so we can have a conversation. But thank all of you for joining, and we will see you next week.